Sarah Martinez had always known how to blend in. At 28, she possessed an understated presence that allowed her to move through crowds unnoticed, a skill that had served her well in her military career. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and worn sneakers that had seen better days. Nothing about her appearance suggested the extraordinary training she had undergone or the classified missions she had completed in some of the world's most dangerous locations. On this particular Saturday evening, Sarah was simply trying to enjoy a rare moment of normalcy. She had been granted a brief leave from her unit, and she chose to spend it in the small coastal town of Millbrook, a place far removed from military bases and government facilities. The town's main street was lined with quaint shops, family-owned restaurants, and a single bar that served as the social hub for locals and the occasional tourist. The Golden Anchor Tavern was exactly the kind of place Sarah appreciated. Unpretentious, quiet, and filled with people who minded their own business. She sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a glass of water and picking at a basket of fries. The bartender, an elderly man with kind eyes, had tried to engage her in conversation earlier, but Sarah had politely deflected his attempts. She was here to observe, to remember what normal life felt like before returning to her demanding reality. The evening took an unexpected turn when a group of college students entered the bar. They were clearly celebrating something, perhaps a graduation or birthday, and their energy was infectious. Sarah watched them with mild amusement as they claimed a large table near the center of the room, their laughter filling the previously quiet space. Among the group was a young woman who caught Sarah's attention. She couldn't have been more than 21, with bright eyes and an easy smile that lit up her entire face. She reminded Sarah of her younger sister, and for a moment Sarah felt a pang of homesickness. The young woman was clearly the center of attention, and it became apparent that the celebration was in her honor. As the evening progressed, the group's festivities became more boisterous. They ordered rounds of drinks and engaged in animated conversations about their futures, their dreams, and their plans to change the world. Sarah found herself drawn into their optimism, remembering a time when she too had believed that anything was possible. The trouble began when Officer Bradley Hutchins entered the establishment. Hutchins was a 10-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department, known throughout the town for his aggressive approach to law enforcement and his particular disdain for anyone he perceived as causing trouble. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet tall with a permanent scowl that seemed etched into his weathered face. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, and tonight was no exception. From the moment Hutchins walked through the door, the atmosphere in the Golden Anchor shifted. Conversations became more subdued, and several patrons glanced nervously in his direction. The bartender straightened up behind the bar, his friendly demeanor replaced by cautious professionalism. Even the college students seemed to sense the change, their celebration becoming more restrained. Hutchins surveyed the room with the predatory gaze of someone looking for trouble. His eyes settled on the table of college students, and Sarah could see his jaw tighten with disapproval. He approached the bar and ordered a beer, but his attention remained fixed on the young people across the room. Sarah had encountered men like Hutchins before, individuals who used their authority as a weapon rather than a tool for protection and service. She recognized the type immediately, the way he carried himself with exaggerated importance, the manner in which he let his gaze linger threateningly on the students, and the obvious pleasure he took in the discomfort his presence caused. The young woman who had caught Sarah's attention earlier was named Emma Caldwell, and she was indeed celebrating her graduation from the State University with a degree in social work. She had plans to dedicate her life to helping disadvantaged children, and her friends had organized this small gathering to honor her achievement and her commitment to making a difference in the world. Emma was naturally outgoing and possessed an infectious enthusiasm that drew people to her. She had been sharing stories about her internship at a local children's shelter, describing the resilience of the kids she worked with and her hopes for the programs she wanted to develop. Her passion was evident to everyone at the table, and her friends hung on every word. As Officer Hutchins continued to observe the group, his expression grew increasingly hostile. In his mind, he saw nothing but a bunch of privileged college kids who thought they were better than the hardworking people of Millbrook. He had grown up in this town, had seen it struggle economically while nearby. Universities attracted students who came and went without contributing anything meaningful to the community. Sarah noticed Hutchins whispering something to the bartender, his eyes never leaving the college students. The bartender's response was non-committal, but Sarah could see the tension building. She had been in enough volatile situations to recognize the warning signs, and every instinct told her that this evening was about to take a dangerous turn. Emma, oblivious to the scrutiny she and her friends were under, continued to celebrate with genuine joy. She raised her glass in a toast to her friends, thanking them for their support throughout her college years and expressing her excitement about the future. Her words were heartfelt and sincere, and even some of the other patrons in the bar smiled at her obvious happiness. But Officer Hutchins saw something entirely different. To him, Emma's confidence looked like arrogance. Her happiness seemed like disrespect, and her very presence in his town felt like an insult. He finished his beer with deliberate slowness, his decision already made. Sarah watched as Hutchins stood up from the bar and began walking toward the table of college students. His movements were purposeful and predatory, and she could see his hand resting casually on his service weapon. The other patrons in the bar seemed to sense what was coming, and several began quietly gathering their things to leave. Emma looked up as the imposing figure of Officer Hutchins approached their table, her smile fading as she took in his hostile expression. Her friends fell silent, suddenly aware that their celebration was about to be interrupted by something far more serious than they had anticipated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. Officer Hutchins loomed over the table where Emma and her friends sat, his presence immediately transforming the celebratory atmosphere into one of fear and uncertainty. The conversations throughout the Golden Anchor had ceased entirely, and the only sounds were the soft clinking of glasses and the distant hum of the air conditioning system. Emma looked up at the officer with confusion rather than fear. She had been raised to respect law enforcement and had never had a negative encounter with police. Her father had always taught her to be polite and cooperative when dealing with authority figures, and she assumed this would be a routine interaction. "Good evening, officer," Emma said with a nervous smile, her voice carrying the slight tremor of someone who was unsure why they were being approached. "Is there something we can help you with?" Hutchins remained silent for several long seconds, his cold stare moving from one student to another before settling back on Emma. His silence was calculated and intimidating, a tactic he had perfected over years of using his badge to assert dominance rather than provide protection. "You kids think you own this place?" Hutchins finally spoke, his voice low and menacing. The question hung in the air like a threat, and Emma's friends exchanged worried glances. Emma blinked in confusion, genuinely not understanding what the officer meant. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't understand. We're just celebrating my graduation." "We haven't done anything wrong." Her honest confusion only seemed to anger Hutchins further. In his twisted perception, her polite response was evidence of the condescending attitude he believed all college students possessed. He stepped closer to the table, his bulk casting a shadow over the young people. "Don't play dumb with me, sweetheart," Hutchins snarled, his use of the word sweetheart dripping with condescension and malice. "You and your little friends have been disturbing the peace all evening. Time to move along." Emma's friend Jake, a pre-law student who had been quietly observing the interaction, decided to speak up. "Officer, we've been keeping our voices down and haven't bothered anyone. We have every right to be here as paying customers." The moment Jake spoke, Hutchins whirled around to face him, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Did I ask you to speak, boy? When I want your opinion, I'll demand it." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Jake immediately fell silent, his face pale with shock. He had never encountered such aggressive behavior from a law enforcement officer, and he was beginning to understand that this situation was far more dangerous than he had initially realized. From her position at the bar, Sarah had been watching the confrontation unfold with growing concern. She recognized Hutchins' behavior as that of someone who was using his authority to intimidate and bully innocent people. Every instinct she had developed through years of training and combat experience told her that this situation was escalating toward violence. Sarah had seen men like Hutchins in various contexts throughout her military career. They were the type who thrived on power over others, who used their position to settle personal grievances or fulfill some twisted need for dominance. She knew that reasoning with such individuals was often impossible, and that their behavior could escalate quickly and unpredictably. Emma, still trying to de-escalate the situation, stood up slowly from her chair. She was several inches shorter than the imposing officer, but she maintained her composure despite the fear that was beginning to creep into her voice. "Officer, I really don't understand what we've done wrong," she said, her hands visible and non-threatening. "If you could please explain what the problem is, we'd be happy to address it. We're not looking for any trouble." Her reasonable response should have diffused the situation, but instead, it seemed to push Hutchins over an invisible edge. The fact that this young woman was refusing to be intimidated, that she was maintaining her dignity in the face of his aggression, infuriated him beyond reason. "The problem," Hutchins said, stepping even closer to Emma, "is that you think you're better than everyone else in this town. You think you can come in here with your college degrees and your fancy words and look down on hardworking people?" Emma shook her head, her confusion genuine and her voice earnest. "That's not true at all, officer. I grew up just 2 towns over. My father works construction and my mother is a nurse. I have nothing but respect for this community." But Hutchins was beyond listening to reason. Years of resentment, personal failures, and a growing sense of his own inadequacy had combined to create a rage that needed an outlet. And tonight, Emma Caldwell had become the unfortunate target of that accumulated anger. The other patrons in the Golden Anchor were now openly staring at the confrontation, but no one dared to intervene. They all knew Hutchins' reputation, and they understood that challenging him would likely result in their own harassment or arrest. The bartender stood frozen behind the bar, his hands gripping a towel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Sarah made a decision. She quietly slipped off her bar stool and began moving closer to the scene, her movements deliberate but unobtrusive. She positioned herself where she could quickly intervene if necessary, while remaining far enough away to avoid drawing Hutchins' attention. Emma's friends sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to help without making the situation worse. They had never encountered such overt aggression from a police officer, and they were learning a harsh lesson about the reality that existed for people who found themselves on the wrong side of corrupt authority. "You know what I think?" Hutchins continued, his voice rising slightly. "I think you and your friends need to learn some respect. Maybe a night in jail will teach you some humility." Emma's eyes widened with shock. "Arrest us for what? We haven't broken any laws. We haven't even raised our voices." "Disorderly conduct," Hutchins replied with a cruel smile. "Public intoxication. Resisting arrest. I can find plenty of charges that will stick." The threat was clear, and Emma realized with growing horror that this officer was planning to arrest her and her friends for no legitimate reason. She looked around the bar, hoping someone would speak up in their defense, but she saw only frightened faces and averted eyes. "Please, officer," Emma said, her voice now clearly showing her fear. "We'll leave right now if that's what you want. We don't want any trouble." But Hutchins had already decided how this encounter would end. He reached for his handcuffs, his movements slow and deliberate, savoring the fear he was creating. He had done this before, used his badge to humiliate and intimidate people who couldn't fight back, and he had never faced any consequences for his actions. Too late for that. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice filled with malicious satisfaction, "you should have thought about the consequences before you decided to disrespect me." As Hutchins reached out to grab Emma's arm, she instinctively pulled back, a natural human reaction to unwanted contact. But in Hutchins' twisted mind, this normal response became resisting arrest, and it provided him with the excuse he had been looking for to escalate the situation to violence. Sarah tensed, recognizing the signs of an imminent assault. She had seen this pattern before. The manufactured justification, the deliberate escalation, and the moment when a corrupt official decided that words were no longer sufficient to satisfy their need for dominance. The moment Emma pulled her arm back from Officer Hutchins' grasp, the situation crossed a line from intimidation into something far more dangerous. Hutchins's face contorted with rage, and his true nature was revealed to everyone in the Golden Anchor. "So you want to resist, do you?" Hutchins growled, his voice carrying a tone that promised violence. "That's a felony, little girl. You just made this a whole lot worse for yourself." Emma raised her hands in a gesture of surrender, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I'm not resisting, officer. I was just startled. Please, I'll cooperate with whatever you need." But Hutchins was beyond reason. The power he felt in this moment, the ability to control and terrorize these young people, had awakened something dark within him. He grabbed Emma's wrist with unnecessary force, twisting it behind her back in a motion that made her cry out in pain. "You should have thought about that before you decided to mouth off to me," he snarled, applying pressure that sent sharp pain shooting up Emma's arm. Her friends watched in horror as their celebration turned into a nightmare. Jake started to rise from his chair, his instinct to protect his friend overwhelming his fear. But one look from Hutchins froze him in place. "Sit down." "Boy, unless you want to join her in jail," Hutchins threatened, his free hand moving to his weapon. "Anyone else want to be a hero tonight?" The bar fell into a deadly silence. The other patrons looked away, some out of fear, others out of shame for their inability to help. The bartender gripped the phone behind the bar but didn't dare make a call, knowing that Hutchins' colleagues would likely support his version of events regardless of what actually happened. Emma tried to remain calm despite the pain in her arm and the growing terror in her chest. "Officer, please, you're hurting me." "I haven't done anything wrong." Her plea seemed to only encourage Hutchins. He yanked her arm higher, forcing her to bend forward to relieve the pressure. "Maybe next time you'll show some respect to your betters." It was then that Emma made a mistake born of desperation and pain. As Hutchins twisted her arm, she instinctively tried to turn to face him, to plead with him to stop hurting her. The movement was reflexive, defensive, but in Hutchins' mind it became another act of resistance. "That's it," he roared, releasing her arm only to grab her by the shoulders. "You want to fight? Let's see how tough you really are." What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present. Officer Bradley Hutchins, a man sworn to protect and serve, drew back his right hand and struck Emma Caldwell across the face with the full force of his considerable strength. The sound of the blow echoed through the Golden Anchor like a gunshot. Emma's head snapped to the side and she stumbled backward, her hand instinctively reaching up to her cheek where a red mark was already beginning to form. Blood trickled from her lip where his ring had cut the soft tissue. The shock of what had just occurred paralyzed everyone in the bar. Emma's friends sat frozen, unable to process that they had just witnessed a police officer assault their friend for no reason. The other patrons stared in disbelief, some covering their mouths in horror. Emma looked up at Hutchins with tears in her eyes, not just from the physical pain but from the complete betrayal of everything she had been taught to believe about justice and law enforcement. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying the weight of her shattered trust and innocence. Hutchins smiled with cruel satisfaction, pleased with the effect of his violence. "Because you needed to learn your place. Because someone had to teach you that actions have consequences." He reached for his handcuffs again, preparing to arrest the young woman he had just assaulted, adding insult to injury by criminalizing her for being the victim of his abuse. In his twisted mind, he had already constructed the story he would tell. How she had attacked him, how he had defended himself, how she had forced him to use necessary force to subdue a violent suspect. But as Hutchins moved to complete his abuse of power, a calm voice cut through the tension in the room. "That's enough." The words were spoken quietly, without anger or hysteria, but they carried an authority that made everyone in the bar turn to look at their source. Sarah Martinez had stepped forward from her position near the wall, and while her posture appeared relaxed, those with trained eyes would have noticed the subtle shift in her stance that spoke of someone prepared for action. Hutchins looked at her with surprise and then growing anger. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone who appeared to be just another civilian. Sarah was still dressed in her casual clothes, still maintaining the unremarkable appearance that had served her so well throughout her career. "This is police business. Lady," Hutchins said, his voice carrying a warning, "move along before you find yourself under arrest too." Sarah looked at Emma, taking in the red mark on her face, the blood on her lip, and the tears in her eyes. She then looked at the young woman's friends, saw their terror and helplessness, and made a decision that would change the course of the evening. "I don't think so," Sarah replied, her voice still calm but now carrying an undertone that suggested she was not someone to be dismissed easily. Hutchins stepped away from Emma, his attention now fully focused on this new challenge to his authority. He was larger than Sarah, outweighed her by at least 70 pounds, and had the advantage of his badge and weapon. In his mind, she was just another civilian who needed to be reminded of her place. "Last warning," he said, his hand moving to his weapon. "Back off now or face the consequences." Sarah didn't move. Instead, she looked directly into Hutchins' eyes with a gaze that had been honed through years of facing enemies in some of the world's most dangerous places. There was no fear in her expression, no uncertainty, just a quiet confidence that suggested she had been in far more dangerous situations than this one. "The only one here who needs to back off is you," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new edge. "You just assaulted an innocent woman for no reason. This ends now." The confrontation had taken on an entirely new dimension. What had begun as the bullying of college students had evolved into something that would test both Hutchins' corrupt authority and Sarah's commitment to protecting the innocent, regardless of the personal cost. Officer Hutchins stared at Sarah with a mixture of disbelief and rage. In his 10 years of using his badge to intimidate and control, he had never encountered someone who dared to challenge him so directly. His ego, already inflated by years of unchecked authority, couldn't process the reality that this unremarkable-looking woman was refusing to back down. "You're making a big mistake." "Lady," Hutchins said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "I'm giving you one last chance to walk away before this gets ugly for you." Sarah remained motionless, her eyes never leaving his face. To the untrained observer, she appeared calm, almost relaxed. But those with military experience would have recognized the subtle signs of someone who was mentally and physically preparing for combat. The slight shift in weight distribution, the way her hands hung loosely at her sides, ready to react in milliseconds. "The only mistake here was yours," Sarah replied, her voice steady and controlled. "You struck an innocent woman. You abused your authority, and now you're threatening me for calling you out on it." Emma, still reeling from the blow she had received, watched the exchange with growing amazement and fear. This stranger, this woman she had never seen before, was standing up to the violent police officer who had just assaulted her. She wanted to tell Sarah to leave to save herself, but she found herself unable to speak. Hutchins took a step toward Sarah, his bulk intended to intimidate. "You want to play hero? Fine. You're under arrest for interfering with police business." He reached for his handcuffs, expecting Sarah to comply or flee like every other civilian he had ever confronted. But Sarah's response was not what he anticipated. "On what grounds?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was genuinely curious rather than afraid. "I haven't interfered with anything. I've simply observed you assault a citizen and voiced my objection to your criminal behavior." The word criminal hit Hutchins like a physical blow. No one had ever dared to apply that term to him, despite the numerous times he had abused his power over the years. His face reddened with fury, and his hand moved from his handcuffs to his weapon. "Criminal," he repeated, his voice rising dangerously. "You just threatened a police officer. That's assault on a law enforcement official." Sarah actually smiled at this, expression that somehow managed to be both pleasant and deeply unsettling. "I haven't threatened you at all. But your attempt to draw your weapon in response to my words certainly constitutes a threat of deadly force against an unarmed civilian." Her calm analysis of the situation, delivered with the precision of someone who understood exactly how law enforcement procedures were supposed to work, rattled Hutchins more than any angry outburst could have. This woman wasn't reacting like the civilians he was used to dealing with. She wasn't showing fear, wasn't backing down, and seemed to understand the legal implications of his actions better than he did. "Who the hell are you?" Hutchins demanded, his confidence beginning to waver for the first time that evening. Sarah tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. "Someone who doesn't appreciate seeing innocent people victimized by those who are supposed to protect them." The simplicity of her answer, delivered without drama or aggression, somehow made it more powerful than any angry declaration could have been. Around the bar, the other patrons watched in fascination as this ordinary-looking woman continued to stand her ground against the officer who had terrorized the community for years. Hutchins made his decision. His ego and his anger had taken control, and he was determined to assert his dominance over this woman who dared to challenge him. He moved forward quickly, intending to grab Sarah and force her to the ground, the same tactic he had used successfully on countless other victims. But Sarah was no longer there when his hands reached the space where she had been standing. In a movement so fluid it seemed almost casual, Sarah stepped to the side, allowing Hutchins' momentum to carry him past her. As he stumbled forward off balance from his failed grab, Sarah's training took over. Years of combat experience, countless hours of hand-to-hand instruction, and an instinctive understanding of leverage and physics combined in a response that was both devastating and elegant. Sarah's right hand shot out, striking Hutchins precisely at the nerve cluster on his wrist, causing his hand to open involuntarily and his weapon to clatter to the floor. Before he could react, her left hand had found the pressure point on his neck, and suddenly the large, imposing police officer was on his knees. Completely immobilized, the entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. The golden anchor erupted in shocked silence. Emma and her friends stared in disbelief at the scene before them. The man who had terrorized them just moments before was now kneeling helplessly, his weapon on the floor, completely at the mercy of the woman he had tried to intimidate. Hutchins struggled against Sarah's hold, but found himself unable to move without causing himself excruciating pain. Her grip was precise and professional, designed to control without causing permanent damage, but absolutely effective in preventing any resistance. "Let me go," he gasped, his voice strained and desperate. "You're assaulting a police officer. I'll have you thrown in prison for this." Sarah's response was delivered in the same calm tone she had maintained throughout the encounter. "You're not being assaulted. You're being restrained to prevent you from committing further violence against innocent civilians." She applied just enough pressure to remind him of his position before continuing. "You drew your weapon without justification, attempted to assault me without cause, and have already committed battery against that young woman. I would suggest you remain very still while we sort this situation out." Emma finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "How did you do that?" Sarah glanced at her briefly, her expression softening with concern for the injured young woman. "Are you hurt badly? Do you need medical attention?" The genuine care in Sarah's voice, such a contrast to the controlled authority she had displayed in dealing with Hutchins, brought fresh tears to Emma's eyes. "I think I'm okay. My face hurts, but I don't think anything is broken." "Good," Sarah said, her attention returning to Hutchins, who was still kneeling in her grip. "Now, officer, we need to discuss how this situation is going to be resolved." But even as she spoke, Sarah was aware that the confrontation was far from over. She could hear sirens in the distance growing louder as they approached the golden anchor. Someone had called for backup, and soon the bar would be filled with Hutchins' colleagues, officers who might be just as corrupt as he was, or who might simply side with him regardless of what had actually occurred. The sirens grew louder as they approached the golden anchor, and Sarah knew she had only moments before the situation became exponentially more complicated. With Hutchins immobilized but conscious, she needed to quickly assess her options and prepare for what was coming next. "Listen carefully," Sarah said to Emma and her friends, her voice urgent but controlled. "When the other officers arrive, they're going to see their colleague on the ground and me standing over him. They may not stop to ask questions before reacting." Emma wiped the blood from her lip with a shaking hand. "What should we do?" "Tell them exactly what happened," Sarah replied. "Don't embellish, don't leave anything out. Officer Hutchins struck you without provocation, and I intervened to prevent further violence." Jake, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Will they believe us?" "I mean, he's one of them." Sarah's expression was grim. "That's the question, isn't it?" The bartender, who had been paralyzed with shock throughout the entire incident, suddenly came to life. "I have security cameras," he announced, his voice cracking with nervous energy. "Everything that happened here is recorded." For the first time since the confrontation began, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "That changes things significantly." Hutchins, still trapped in her restraining hold, tried to speak. "Those cameras, they don't show everything. My word against yours, and I'm a decorated officer with 10 years of service." "Your word," Sarah said quietly, "just lost a lot of credibility when you assaulted an innocent woman in front of 24 witnesses." The sirens reached the parking lot outside, and the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the night air. Sarah made a quick decision and released her hold on Hutchins, stepping back with her hands clearly visible. The officer collapsed forward, gasping and rubbing his neck where she had applied pressure. "Remember," she said to the room at large, "everyone saw what really happened here." The front door of the Golden Anchor burst open, and 3 Millbrook police officers rushed inside with their weapons drawn. They quickly assessed the scene, their colleague on the ground, his weapon on the floor, and a woman standing calmly nearby with her hands raised. "Nobody move." shouted the lead officer, a sergeant named Rodriguez who had worked with Hutchins for several years. Everyone keep your hands where we can see them. Sarah complied immediately, her military training teaching her the importance of de-escalation when dealing with armed and potentially confused law enforcement. Officers, I'm unarmed and I'm not resisting. Hutchins struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage. Arrest her, he shouted, pointing at Sarah. She attacked me. Assaulted a police officer. Sergeant Rodriguez looked confused as he tried to piece together what had happened. The scene didn't match any of the scenarios he had been expecting when he received the call for backup. Bradley, what's your status? Are you injured? She used some kind of martial arts on me, Hutchins said, still breathing heavily. Came out of nowhere and attacked me while I was trying to make an arrest. Emma stepped forward despite her fear. That's not what happened. He hit me first. He struck me in the face for no reason. Rodriguez looked at the young woman and noticed the red mark on her cheek and the dried blood on her lip. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. Ma'am, are you saying Officer Hutchins struck you? Yes, sir, Emma replied, her voice growing stronger. We were just celebrating my graduation when he approached our table. We didn't do anything wrong, but he became aggressive and threatening. When I tried to ask what we had done, he twisted my arm and then hit me across the face. Jake and the other students nodded in agreement, and several of the bar patrons began to speak up as well. Corroborating Emma's account of events, she's lying, Hutchins protested. They were causing a disturbance and she resisted arrest. When this woman interfered, I was defending myself. But Rodriguez was a good officer, one who took his oath seriously, and he could see the inconsistencies in Hutchins's story. The young woman clearly bore the marks of being struck, and her demeanor suggested genuine trauma rather than deception. Bradley, did you strike this woman? Rodriguez asked directly. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Hutchins looked around the bar, seeing the faces of the witnesses, all of whom had seen exactly what had occurred. His usual tactics of intimidation and lies were useless here. She was resisting arrest, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I used necessary force to subdue a violent suspect. The bartender stepped forward, holding up his phone. Officer, I called our security company. The whole thing is on camera. Everything. Rodriguez turned to look at the security cameras mounted near the ceiling, their red recording lights clearly visible. The existence of video evidence changed everything, and he knew it. Sarah, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Sergeant, I'm willing to provide a full statement about what I witnessed here tonight. But I think you should be aware that Officer Hutchins drew his weapon on me without justification and attempted to physically assault me when I verbally objected to his treatment of that young woman. Rodriguez looked at Sarah more carefully, noting her calm demeanor and precise way of speaking. Ma'am, can you tell me your name? Sarah Martinez, she replied simply. And what's your background, Ms. Martinez? You seem very comfortable in this situation. Sarah hesitated for a moment, knowing that revealing her military status would complicate matters, but also recognizing that her credibility might be important for Emma's sake. I'm active duty military, Sergeant. I've been trained to recognize and respond to threats. Rodriguez nodded, pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. What branch? Navy, Sarah said, still not revealing the full extent of her training and capabilities. Hutchins laughed bitterly. Navy? What's a sailor know about law enforcement? She probably learned some basic self-defense and thinks she's tough. Rodriguez ignored his colleague's comment and focused on Sarah. Ms. Martinez, how exactly did you subdue Officer Hutchins? Sarah's response was precise and professional. I used a standard restraining technique designed to prevent him from drawing his weapon and causing harm to the civilians in this establishment. He was not injured, just immobilized until backup could arrive. The sergeant looked at Hutchins, who was still rubbing his neck and wrist. For a large, physically imposing man to be subdued so quickly and effectively by someone of Sarah's size suggested a level of training that went far beyond basic military instruction. Ma'am, Rodriguez said carefully, exactly what is your position in the Navy? It was then that Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She reached slowly into her back pocket and withdrew a small leather credential case. With deliberate movements, she opened it and handed it to Rodriguez. The sergeant's eyes widened as he read the identification inside. The credentials identified Sarah Martinez as a member of the United States Navy SEALs, one of the most elite special operations forces in the world. Jesus, Rodriguez whispered under his breath, suddenly understanding how Hutchins had been so easily controlled. Hutchins leaned over to see what had caused such a reaction, and his face went pale as he read the credentials. The woman he had tried to intimidate, the person he had drawn his weapon on, was one of the most highly trained warriors in the American military. The revelation of Sarah's identity as a Navy SEAL sent shockwaves through the Golden Anchor. Sergeant Rodriguez stared at the credentials, reading them twice to make sure he understood what he was seeing. The other officers behind him exchanged glances, suddenly realizing they were dealing with someone whose training and capabilities far exceeded anything they had encountered in their law enforcement careers. Hutchins felt the blood drain from his face as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. He had not only assaulted an innocent civilian and drawn his weapon on a member of the military, but he had targeted one of the most elite warriors in the United States Armed Forces. The arrogance and false confidence that had carried him through years of abusing his authority crumbled in an instant. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice now carrying a tone of deep respect, "I need to understand exactly what happened here tonight." Sarah accepted her credentials back and returned them to her pocket. "Sergeant, I was having a quiet drink when Officer Hutchins approached that table of college students. Without provocation, he became aggressive and threatening toward them. When the young woman attempted to ask what they had done wrong, he physically assaulted her, striking her across the face." She gestured toward Emma, whose injury was clearly visible to all the officers present. "When I objected to his behavior," Sarah continued, "Officer Hutchins threatened me, drew his weapon without justification, and attempted to physically assault me. I used minimal force to restrain him until backup could arrive." Rodriguez turned to look at Hutchins, whose story was rapidly falling apart. "Bradley, is this true? Did you strike this young woman?" Hutchins tried to maintain his defiance, but the presence of multiple witnesses, security cameras, and now a Navy SEAL who had first-hand knowledge of his actions made any attempt at deception futile. "She was resisting arrest," he said weakly, but even he could hear how hollow the excuse sounded. Emma stepped forward, her voice stronger now that she realized she had support. "Officer, I wasn't under arrest. He never told us we were under arrest. He just started threatening us and then hit me when I asked what we had done wrong." The bartender approached the group cautiously. "Officers, I've already contacted our security company. They can provide the footage immediately if you need it." Rodriguez nodded. "That would be helpful. We'll need to review everything that happened here tonight." One of the other officers, a young patrolman named Thompson, looked at Sarah with barely concealed awe. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what brings a Navy SEAL to Millbrook?" Sarah smiled slightly. "I'm on leave. I just wanted to have a quiet evening in a peaceful town." The irony of her statement wasn't lost on anyone present. She had come seeking peace and instead had encountered exactly the kind of injustice and corruption she had spent her career fighting against in far-off places. Hutchins made one last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Rodriguez, you've known me for 7 years. Are you really going to take the word of some outsider over a fellow officer?" The sergeant looked at his colleague with disappointment and growing anger. "Bradley, there are 24 witnesses here who all saw you strike that young woman. There's video evidence. And you drew your weapon on a member of our armed forces who was simply objecting to your abuse of power." He paused, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Even if she wasn't a Navy SEAL, what you did was wrong. But the fact that you threatened someone who has dedicated her life to defending this country makes it even worse." Sarah held up a hand. "Sergeant, I don't want special treatment because of my military status. What matters here is that an innocent young woman was assaulted by someone who was supposed to protect her." Her words resonated throughout the bar. Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes, not from pain this time, but from gratitude toward this stranger who had risked herself to defend someone she didn't even know. Rodriguez made his decision. "Bradley Hutchins, you're under arrest for assault and battery, abuse of authority, and threatening a member of the armed forces." The words hit Hutchins like physical blows. "You can't do this. I'm a police officer." "Not anymore," Rodriguez replied grimly as he moved to handcuff his former colleague. "You've disgraced the badge and betrayed everything we're supposed to stand for." As Rodriguez read Hutchins his rights, Sarah approached Emma, who was still shaking from the trauma of the evening. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked gently. "Do you need medical attention?" Emma touched her cheek where the red mark was already beginning to darken into a bruise. I think I'm okay physically. But I can't believe this actually happened. I can't believe a police officer would do something like this. Sarah's expression was compassionate but serious. Unfortunately, there are people in every profession who abuse their power. The important thing is that there are also people willing to stand up to them. Jake approached them cautiously. Ma'am, we can't thank you enough for what you did. If you hadn't been here— He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what he meant. Without Sarah's intervention, Hutchins might have arrested all of them on false charges, and his assault on Emma would have been covered up as necessary force during an arrest. Sarah shook her head. You don't need to thank me. Anyone should have done what I did. The problem is that too many people are afraid to speak up when they see injustice. Sergeant Rodriguez approached them after securing Hutchins in the patrol car. Ms. Martinez, we'll need a full statement from you. And ma'am, he said to Emma, we'll need you to file a formal complaint and provide a statement as well. Emma nodded, though she still seemed overwhelmed by the evening's events. Will anything actually happen to him? I mean, will there really be consequences? Rodriguez's expression was grim but determined. With the evidence we have, multiple witnesses, video footage, and the testimony of a Navy SEAL, he's going to face serious charges. This isn't going to be swept under the rug. Sarah noticed that Emma was still trembling, the shock and adrenaline of the encounter finally catching up with her. Is there someone you can call? Family or friends who can be with you tonight? My parents live about an hour away, Emma said. But I don't want to worry them. They're going to be more worried if they find out what happened and you didn't tell them, Sarah pointed out gently. As the evening continued to unfold, with statements being taken and evidence being gathered, word of what had happened began to spread throughout the small town. The story of the Navy SEAL who had taken down a corrupt police officer to protect an innocent college student would become legendary in Millbrook. But more importantly, it would mark the beginning of real change in how law enforcement was held accountable in the community. 3 months later, the courtroom in Millbrook was packed with residents who had come to witness the conclusion of a case that had shaken their small community to its core. The trial of former Officer Bradley Hutchins had drawn national attention, not just because of the abuse of power it represented, but because of the remarkable woman who had intervened to stop it. Sarah Martinez sat in the witness section, wearing her dress uniform at the request of the prosecution. Her chest displayed ribbons and commendations that told the story of a distinguished military career, though she remained as understated and professional as she had been that night in the Golden Anchor. Next to her sat Emma Caldwell, who had become not just a witness in the case but a close friend and advocate for police reform. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case against Hutchins. The security footage from the bar had been damning, showing clearly that Emma and her friends had done nothing wrong, that Hutchins had escalated the situation without cause, and that he had struck Emma without any justification. Multiple witnesses had testified to his aggressive behavior and abuse of authority, but perhaps most powerful had been Sarah's testimony. Her calm, precise recounting of the events, delivered with the authority of someone who had dedicated her life to protecting others, had left no doubt in anyone's mind about what had really happened that night. Defense attorney Marcus Webb made his closing argument, still trying to portray Hutchins as a dedicated officer who had simply made an error in judgment, but his words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence against his client. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Webb said, his voice lacking conviction, we're not here to judge Officer Hutchins's entire career based on one moment of poor judgment. He served this community faithfully for 10 years. When Prosecutor Diana Chen rose to make her closing statement, the courtroom fell silent. She had built her career on holding corrupt officials accountable, and this case represented everything she had fought against throughout her legal career. Members of the jury, Chen began, this case is not about one moment of poor judgment. This is about a pattern of abuse, intimidation, and violence that went unchecked. For years, because no one had the courage to stand up to it. She gestured toward Sarah. It took a member of our nation's most elite military forces to finally put a stop to Bradley Hutchins' reign of terror. But the real tragedy is that it should never have gotten to that point. Chen walked over to where Emma sat, the faded bruise on her cheek still visible as a reminder of that night's violence. Emma Caldwell was celebrating one of the most important achievements of her young life when she was brutally, assaulted by someone who had sworn to protect her. She was guilty of nothing more than existing in a space that Bradley Hutchins felt he controlled. The prosecutor returned to face the jury. The defendant wants you to believe this was an isolated incident, a momentary lapse in judgment. But the evidence shows us something far more disturbing. This was a man who had learned that he could abuse his power without consequences, who believed that his badge gave him the right to intimidate and hurt innocent people. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The only reason Bradley Hutchins is sitting in that defendant's chair today is because he finally picked on someone who had the training and courage to fight back. How many other victims were there who didn't have a Navy SEAL to protect them? When the jury returned after less than 2 hours of deliberation, their verdict was swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts: assault and battery, abuse of authority under color of law, and making terroristic threats. The courtroom erupted in applause, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Judge Patricia Morrison, a respected jurist with 30 years of experience, looked directly at Hutchins as she prepared to impose sentence. "Mr. Hutchins," she said, her voice carrying the weight of justice, "you have betrayed not only the oath you took as a police officer, but the trust of every citizen in this community. Your actions that night were not those of a protector, but of a predator who used his authority to victimize the innocent," she continued. "The court sentences you to 5 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. You are permanently barred from ever serving in law enforcement again in any capacity." As Hutchins was led away in handcuffs, many in the courtroom felt that justice had finally been served. But for Sarah and Emma, the real work was just beginning. Outside the courthouse, Emma addressed the gathered media and community members. The shy college student who had been celebrating her graduation 3 months earlier had been transformed by her experience into a passionate advocate for reform. "This case was never just about what happened to me," Emma said, her voice clear and strong. "It was about creating a system where police officers who abuse their power are held accountable for their actions." She looked over at Sarah, who stood nearby, still uncomfortable with the attention her actions had brought. "Sarah Martinez didn't just save me that night. She showed all of us what it means to stand up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. She's a true hero, not because of her military training, but because she was willing to risk herself to protect a stranger." When the reporters turned to Sarah for comment, she stepped forward reluctantly. She had always preferred to let her actions speak louder than her words. "I didn't do anything that any decent person shouldn't have done," Sarah said simply. Emma was being victimized by someone who was supposed to protect her. The only appropriate response was to stop it. She paused, looking out at the assembled crowd. "But this case should remind all of us that we have a responsibility to speak up when we see injustice. We can't just assume that someone else will do the right thing." A reporter called out, "What's next for you, Ms. Martinez?" Sarah smiled slightly. "I'm returning to active duty. There's still work to be done protecting our country and its values." As the crowd began to disperse, Emma approached Sarah one last time. Despite their different backgrounds and the circumstances that had brought them together, they had formed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. "I still can't believe you're going back to active duty after everything that's happened," Emma said. "You could probably write your own ticket anywhere after this." Sarah shook her head. "This is what I do, Emma. I serve my country and protect people who can't protect themselves. That doesn't change just because it happened in a bar in Millbrook instead of a combat zone overseas." Emma smiled, tears in her eyes. "You've changed my life, you know. I'm going to law school next year. I want to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. That's the best outcome I could have hoped for," Sarah replied. "You're going to make an incredible lawyer." As Sarah walked away from the courthouse, she reflected on the events that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Millbrook seeking a quiet evening away from the demands of her military career. Instead, she had found herself confronting the same kinds of injustice and corruption that she fought against around the world. But she had also discovered something equally important, that the principles she defended abroad were just as vital at home, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in distant countries, but in small-town bars where ordinary people needed someone to stand up for them. The story of the Navy SEAL who took down a corrupt police officer would be told and retold throughout Millbrook for years to come. But for Sarah Martinez, it was simply another day of doing what she had always done, protecting those who needed protection and standing up for what was right, regardless of the odds or the consequences. As she drove away from Millbrook, returning to her unit and her ongoing service to her country, Sarah knew that the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or in the media attention. It was in the knowledge that Emma Caldwell would never again have to face injustice alone, and that one corrupt officer would never again be able to victimize the innocent. Sometimes, that was enough.